Oh, thank you for that glorious introduction. I want to first, before we begin our presentation, thank the Hallenstein Center for doing a spectacular job of organizing this conference. I had thought Tori had been doing these for years and was surprised to find out it's her first conference, because it's been a really wonderful thing to have it run smoothly and not have to worry about very much at all, and just show up and be here. And I also want to thank Herman Keizer for when we started the center 2 years ago, we could not have made the kind of progress at the Soul Repair Center we've been able to make, except for the fact that Herm was willing to come out of retirement for the third time, was it? I think he has trouble retiring, but he's not a retiring person, that's true. And consulting with us as a founding co-director of the Soul Repair Center, and his deep contacts in the military have pushed us forward on work that would have probably taken us many more years to achieve, because his social capital is extraordinary. So, I'm delighted to be presenting with him. And some of you that were here last night, how many of you were not here last night? Okay. So I won't refer too much to what Dr. Shea said, although it was taped, I highly recommend watching it. But we're going to be talking about moral injury. This is the thing the Soul Repair Center is dedicated to public education about. So I'm going to try to make a case for why we should stop using the term PTSD. It was a case that Dr. Shea made last night, but it stigmatizes what is a normal human response to tragedy and trauma, as if it were a disorder. And there are dimensions of post-traumatic stress that do create a disorder, an actual brain disorder. But I think for the estimated 500,000 to more troops from the last 2 wars who are supposed to have PTSD, I think they don't have PTSD, or they have a mild case of PTSD and a serious case of moral injury. So I think it's more helpful actually to talk about moral injury, because injury is just something that it occurs. It's not a stigmatizing thing like a disorder. So I'm going to just lay out a scenario for you and help you think through some of what moral injury might involve. So imagine that you're in the back Humvee rear guarding a convoy heading down Jackson Road or some road in Iraq, and it's a supply convoy. It's kind of a long convoy, and you're at the back. You can't see the front too well, and you're driving, and the rules of convoy driving are that you drive down the middle of the road absolutely as fast as you can take that road safely, and you do not stop for anything unless it looks like it's going to blow you up. So you might stop for a wrecked car sitting in the middle of the road, because often they have bombs planted in them, but you're not going to stop for children, you're not going to stop for women, you're not going to stop for people in the road. You just run right over them, because if you stop, you're sitting duck for an attack. So you put your whole convoy in danger if you stop. So you're barreling down this road, and you're in the rear guard, and you look out, and in the distance you see this figure. And this figure is walking your direction, kind of over toward a village that your convoy is about to enter. The village is on the side of the road, and there's a sort of curve, and you can't see too well what's up ahead. So you have now spotted this figure, and you're just sort of out there by yourself, and you're wondering what's going on, and the convoy stops. And it's very fast. You don't know why. But you've just entered that village, so there's sort of buildings around. It's a little hard to see, and you're scanning now. The convoy stopped. You're on high alert. You're scanning, and this figure walks out from some buildings toward you. Now, there's a little bulge in the front of that burqa. You don't know what that bulge is. You don't know whether that bulge is because it's a woman in a burqa who's pregnant, and she may just be trying to go behind you to cross the road to get home to cook dinner for her family. Or it could be a man with a bomb strapped to his body. or a woman's the bomb strapped to her body. You just can't tell. So you have to make a decision, because maybe no one else has spotted her, or other people are trying to figure this out also. You have to make a decision, if you don't get an order, whether to shoot, because this is a person who's going to blow up your convoy, or wait because you think it's a pregnant woman, but if she gets too close and she has a bomb, you may lose part of your company. So this is the dilemma. When you're fighting an insurgency, when you're occupying a country and there's no army, everybody is suspect for being dangerous. So the question is, would you shoot or would you wait? And that's how long you'd have to decide. And you wouldn't know the truth of what is going on. You would not know the actual outcome of the decision you make until after you make it. And you may make a decision at that moment that will affect the rest of your life. I'm going to play you a short speech that Captain Tyler Boudreau made to the Northampton City Council in Massachusetts. He's a retired Marine captain who guarded, his job of his Marine unit for a while was to keep Jackson Road open in Iraq. And this is the Northampton City Council was considering a resolution to urge diplomacy with Iran rather than war with Iran. So that's sort of just the context in which he made the speech. But he makes a really impassioned speech about war to the City Council in the context of what I just described to you, that kind of situation in war.
Good evening, Tyler Boudreau, 42 East Center Street, Leeds. And I'll return the time to Francis when time comes later. I'd like to talk this evening about the resolution on Iran. I have 12 years in the Marine Corps Infantry. I was an infantry officer in Iraq. I participated in hundreds of combat operations. I understand warfare. Let me say first that if there comes a time that America deems it necessary to force a regime change in Iran, there will be troops on the ground. So as a veteran of our current war, let me share with you just a taste of what we can expect from a future war. My final assignment as a Marine officer was as the rear echelon commander for 2nd Marine Regiment, 2nd Marine Division at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The regiment was forward in Iraq, and for every casualty that they took, it was my job to call home to the families and let them know. I made a lot of calls. Sometimes I would only have to say my name, Captain Boudreau, United States Marine Corps, and that was enough. I would hear the voice on the other end of the line breaking down into tears. Because you see, they knew what my name meant. They knew that it meant something terrible had happened. And then I would have to confirm their suspicions and say, yes, something terrible has happened. Now I'll tell you, and I'm sure you can imagine, it was no easy task telling mom and dad that their boy was coming home without his face, or without his arms, or without his legs. The war itself paled in comparison to that. It was no easy task telling them that his body was burned badly, that his lungs were punctured, that his spleen was ruptured, that his colon was obliterated, that his femur was shattered. I cannot begin to describe for you their grief when I told them that. I held in my hand one night a casualty report about a Marine in Iraq, and he was going into surgery to have both his legs amputated. This report was 14 hours old. I didn't know his condition or his location. I didn't know if he'd made it through surgery, or if he was alive or dead, All I knew was that he was alone in Iraq getting his legs cut off. And that is what I had to tell his mother. So you can expect that his mother did not receive me well. She screamed at me. She cried. She cursed me in the Marine Corps. Then she hung up on me. And then she called me back at midnight looking for updates. But there were no updates. So she called me back again at 1 and 2 and 3 in the morning. She was begging me for good news. But I didn't have any good news to give her because I wasn't in the good news business. And all the while, throughout this country, there was an epidemic spreading quietly, an epidemic of suicides among veterans. Thousands of them taking their own lives here in the safety of America for what can only be explained as an inability to reconcile the deeds that they've done in war with their sense of morality. What this suicide epidemic made me notice was that in all those casualty calls that I made, in all those wounds that I had to report to the families, hundreds of them, hundreds, never once did I pick up the phone and say to Mom and Dad, your son is coming home with a broken heart. Never once did I say that. In these times of war, it seems to me that our thoughts tend to linger on the battlefield, amongst those stories, glorious and tragic, of the service members in the fight. But in doing so, we can sometimes forget about the war's devastation right here at home, to our own families, and to our humanity as a people. I would like to see this community not forget and demand of our government that they exercise diplomacy rather than aggression. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So what Tyler is talking about is moral injury and making those tough decisions when you don't know whether you're going to shoot an innocent pregnant woman or a person with a bomb. And if you shoot an innocent person, you've just violated the rules of engagement you carry in your own breast pocket that says a good soldier doesn't kill innocent civilians. So there are lots of moral codes involved in moral injury that get violated, but we don't have a good process for helping people come to terms with it. So we have about somewhere like 55,000 people from these wars who are disabled, who have had the kind of physical injuries that require artificial limbs or special medical care or lifelong medical care. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 55,000, and because 88 or so percent of a high percentage of the injuries are from explosions rather than bullets. People have body armor that protects their vital organs, but they lose limbs or they have traumatic brain injury. That's 55,000. The estimate is that 500,000, 10 times that number, have something they call PTSD. So these are the hidden wounds of war, and that's what this conference is about, the hidden wounds of war. And moral injury, a lot of VA clinicians are thinking is more a factor, far more a factor in the suicide rates than PTSD. That the media reports are all about PTSD. 2 weeks ago, Huffington Post did a 3-part series on moral injury that's quite excellent, but it's the first major media article really seriously to take on the moral injury issues, so I highly recommend it. But the problem with moral injury, of course, is that it's not necessarily something that that you would experience right away. You might, in the urgency of war and the protecting of your comrades and to try to do your job, not be thinking about the moral implications. You're doing what you've been asked to do. You come home, you're busy going to school, you're just so happy to be home, you're task-oriented, get a job, go to school, get married, take care of your family. And it's after that urgency slows down, if you actually have to settle into ordinary civilian life, that you may start thinking. You may start wondering, who was I? And how can I be back? How can I be a decent father to my children when I did such terrible things? And that's when the moral injury issues sink in, and they can come at the end of life after years and years and years of not thinking about these things. They can come in the immediate aftermath of the act itself. You just never know. But it's an ancient wound of war. It's not a new thing we've just discovered war causes. As Jonathan last night said, it's in Homer, it's in the Bible, it's in all great war literature, this moral anguish about war. So just so you get the sort of sense of the difference between PTSD and moral injury, this is actually the effect of PTSD on a brain. So it isn't just a simple thing that is in your mind. And this is something civilians also get from natural disasters, and people who work in lots of civilians also can. It's about 7% they think of the civilian population has it. But you can see in the lower part of the image of the brain, that's your limbic brain fear center that helps you sense and feel things, and the amygdala there is what goes on. It's like your smoke alarm system when you're in danger, that your fear center dumps cortisol and adrenaline in your system, and your system is screaming in high alert that there's danger. And that's this part of your brain. If that part of your brain is stressed enough, it starts to grow new tissue. It starts to actually get stronger to deal with the emergencies that you're in. The problem is that when you leave an emergency situation, if you have PTSD, that part of your brain doesn't know how to turn itself off. Because this part of your brain that does the turning off, the frontal cortex area, your thinking brain that controls your feelings and behavior, has lost tissue. It actually gets less dense. So it's just not as strong as it was. And this part gets stronger. And so you just have these high, panic attacks, hyperarousal, all the kinds of symptoms that come with PTSD. And those can be treated, and there are many, many good treatments. They've been doing a lot more research on PTSD. But the moral injury piece is the deeper problem. So this was in the Huffington Post article a couple of weeks ago. You can see there's flashbacks, lots of fear, like you can't go in crowds, you have to sit with your back to the wall and see all the exits, all of those fear reactions, a hyper arousal. Often you don't have a very coherent memory because you flash back instead of really remembering, and you have a high startle reflex. That's PTSD. This set of symptoms can occur with PTSD, but they're also part of the cluster around moral injury. So anger is a big one. Of course, fear, aggression, and anger all sort of cohere. So if somebody has a high fear factor in their PTSD, they're also probably likely to have a fair amount of anger. So if you're working with veterans, you just have to get used to people who are sometimes angry, and you don't need to take it personally. It's just part of what comes home from war. And then you can be depressed, be anxious, not be able to sleep, have nightmares, and drink a lot. And those things can be part of PTSD, or they can be because you're feeling ashamed of who you are, and you don't feel like you can live anymore, you're in a state of despair. They can come from feeling like you didn't do the right thing, and you're feeling guilty about that. You may have lost your company or your best friend in battle and feel intense sorrow and grief that doesn't have anywhere to go. You may regret things you've done. And mostly, you don't want to talk about it because it's too anguishing, and you're pretty sure people are going to judge you or not understand. So you wind up being alienated and isolated with the people who want to help but don't know how to help, and you don't know how to tell them how to help. So those are all parts of the things that happen with moral injury. And I'm going to skip this image and take. So Herm's going to talk a little bit about this transition from being 18 and being a civilian and winding up in the military, and what happens to you?
Thanks, Rita. One of the most powerful transitions that I've ever went through in my life is going through basic training. It's a rite of passage like no other that I've ever experienced. And when I was drafted in 1962, I went through basic training as an ordinary soldier. And I remember going in, and in those days I had hair, and I used to comb it back and tuck it in so that it looked like the south end of a duck flying north. And some of you shake your head like you remember that. And I sat down in the barber shop, and he said, "How would you like it?" I said, "Just take a little off the side." And he gave me my first experience of my part now. And right down the middle, and just shaved it all off. Then I was taken over and given a uniform, and I looked just like everybody else. Then I lost my first name, because on my uniform was Keizer. So I was no longer Herman, but I was now Keizer. And then the first week, we learned what our real left foot was, so we could start off marching. And then every week, we went through a different kind of exercise and a different kind of activity. And at the end of that, we were rewarded with some kind of way of knowing that we had overcome and we had really mastered part of the craft of being a soldier. We went to bivouac, and this was the 8th week. And we had a terrible time in bivouac. We were at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and they have 2 hills at Fort Knox. One is called Agony, and the other one is called Misery. And when you're walking up them, you know that they are well named. And we're muddy, and we were just dirty and smelly from being out a whole week. And as we walked in, we were going past the reception center, and there was a busload of recruits coming in to get their hair cut. And we were walking at Road March, and the guy said, "Herm, call cadence." So I started calling cadence, and we started marching. And as we walked by that barber shop, I said, "Eyes right." And everybody went like that. And we looked at those guys, and they were recruits, and we were soldiers. And that happened in 8 weeks. And one of the things that basic training is, it's a training into a new moral kind of system. And I think it's important to understand that that's a different kind of moral system, but it is a moral system. It has all kinds of intense, prolonged kind of training, but it also represents some very high values in our system. And so military training prepares people for combat. And part of what military training does is it makes people fire reflexively. And when I first was in basic training, we had standard targets that were standard distance away, and you would just shoot at try and hit the little circle. When I came back in and was chaplain for a basic training unit, all that had changed, and now there were pop-up targets that were silhouettes of human beings that would pop up at all different lengths down the range, and you had to shoot them, and you were shooting at silhouetted human beings. And as I was in the military, it became much more sophisticated, the kind of training that people got. Many of you have seen the training on TV where a man is walking, or a soldier's walking down the street, and all of a sudden, there on top of the roof is someone with a weapon. All of a sudden, a dog runs across his path. All of a sudden, he sees a window open and a child there, and a person he or she has to make the kind of decision very, very quickly as to whether to pull the trigger or not pull the trigger. And so that's a kind of reflexive kind of thing. You don't think about it, you just do it. And I talked a lot with general officers who were in training and doctrine command, and I said, is that really the kind of training you want people to do? Do you want them to be so reflexive that they don't even reflect on what they're doing? And General Max Herman told me, he says, "Chaplain Keizer, our job is to train the soldiers so that they're most survivable on the battlefield. That's what my moral challenge is." And so reflexive training is the kind of thing that makes soldiers shoot very, very accurately. After World War II, about 20% of soldiers shot to kill. And Now during these wars, about 90 to 95% shoot to kill. Then you have a tremendous change in weaponry where you have crew-served weapons that are automatic and fire really quickly. In addition to that kind of training, one of the things that happened in accepting the military lifestyle is you dehumanize the enemy. The enemy becomes something less than human, and he has to become less than human because he becomes an object that you can take and you can kill. There are also problems of picking up human remains. I never thought that that would be a real problem because before I went to the military, I worked for an undertaker, and I was used to picking up remains, but not the kind of remains that I saw in combat, not the kind of wounds that you die from in your bed. And so picking up those human remains, it really becomes something that really makes you look at yourself and your own humanity and wonder just exactly what in the world is this all worth. There are other kinds of things than killing the enemy that happen in combat too that are sometimes more of an effect and a negative effect on people, and that's killing other non-combatants. One of the things you're trained to do is to not kill innocent people. That's one of the rules of conduct of war. And the other is to lose someone by friendly fire. I'll never forget one time in Vietnam where the artillery was called into the wrong place and it landed right in the middle of one of the companies that was attached to the battalion. And the officer who was calling in the coordinates for that firing and the people in the artillery tubes who had fired that were really a moral wreck by the time I got to them because they had killed some of their own. And sometimes having your friends killed brings out all kinds of rage in you. And so you begin to be enraged and you go and start killing just for the sake of killing. There's a failure to save others. And as Dr. Shea mentioned last night, one of the things that is very, very difficult is the failure of leadership. And when your leaders fail you, then you really have problems. And then one of the things that happens in long wars is you soon begin to wonder whether what you're fighting for really has any significance. What are the goals? The young captain of the Marines that you saw up there talks another time about how he would send people out because he was there convinced that he was doing something to help the Iraqis. And as he was there more and more, he began to question whether he was really helping the Iraqis or if that was just a facade that he put down that allowed himself to go into combat. And he decided that it was more a facade than really being able to help the Iraqis. And then finally, I think one of the biggest problems with combat these days is the betrayal on the part of our senior leadership. I've never read articles like toxic leadership when I was in, but there's all kinds of articles now talking about the kind of toxic leadership that leads to all kinds of problems on the battlefield. We had that same kind of problems after Vietnam, and we did a lot to try to reinvent the officer and non-commissioned officer corps. And now we're having to go through, I think, the same kind of thing. And you'll see a lot of people being taken away from the Army and being discharged because they just don't have the capabilities to lead people. Now, one of the problems with war is that it becomes so very, very morally ambiguous, as Rita has mentioned. One of the young men tells a story about having to go up onto the roof of a building because his friends were going to defuse an IED. And he went up there and he was told by the commander, if you see something suspicious, engage it or shoot it. And so he went up and he was up there, his friends were about 30 feet away from that IED, and he saw this man walking out of a building with a cell phone in his hand. And he knows that cell phones can detonate IEDs, and so right away he's suspicious and leery of this man. His friends get closer. They're now about 5 feet away from the IED, and the man turns and starts walking away from it and starts dialing his phone. And so the young soldier killed him. And then they find out that that IED could only be pressure detonated and could not have been detonated by a cell phone. And so he says, I killed an innocent person. He was probably talking to his wife about what to bring home for supper. And his commander comes and says to him, no, you did the right thing. And he says, no, I didn't. Everything you trained me to do was not to take innocent civilian life, and I killed an innocent civilian. And that's part of the kind of orientation that happens when you move into the military into an entirely different kind of moral context. Many of the things that you have to do as a soldier are things that you don't do in normal life, like kill other people. And so one of the things that happens is you're reformed into a different kind of moral society, and as we go on, you'll see the consequences of some of that.
So if you're a man, you go from being an ordinary civilian into a military culture, which some people call a hyper-masculine culture. The virtues that soldiers are taught are what are called masculine virtues: strength, courage, endurance, those sorts of things. So if you're a woman, your job is to transition from being a civilian woman into a military man. Right? Because there are no women's divisions anymore, and it hasn't been since the mid-'70s that we've had WACs and waves and people like that. What we have now are women who are integrated into men's units, and it's starting in '93, I think it was, women started being integrated into combat units. Not just into the medical units or the motor pool or whatever, but into the combat units. Technically, women weren't supposed to be in combat, but I've talked to plenty of female veterans who were machine gunners, and I mean they fought in combat. It's just that they've now, about a year ago, been officially allowed into combat, which means they can collect combat pay. But when you're a woman, there are other issues you face in trying to adapt to military culture, like proving yourself so that you're one of the guys, as it were, so that you're a part of the team, because it's really important to be part of the team and to do your job well and to be respected for the work you do. At the same time that you're a minority, sometimes you're the only woman in your whole unit. This happened to Jessica Dell, who was in the 1st Marine Mortuary Unit in Iraq, and she was the only woman in the unit. And she talks in her memoir about what it's like to be a female Marine. And she, at the end of the book, says, if I had a son, she said, I love the Marine Corps, I love being a Marine. If I had a son that wanted to be a Marine, I'd sign the papers in a minute. If I had a daughter that wanted to be a Marine, I'd do everything to stop her. It was so hard. Because you not only are trying to be one of the team, but maybe a member of your team raped you. Or sexually harassed you, called you, there's a lot of, called you girl, harassed you, and didn't take you seriously because you're a woman. Those are all things that happen to women in the military. Now, sexual assault is not a women's issue. 53% of the victims are men. But it's disproportionately occurring to women, because there's a smaller number and there's a higher percentage of women. So those are all kind of things that, as a woman in the military, and women in the military are absolutely crucial and important, but being in the military, there are a whole other series of hurdles that you have to go through to be in the military. And the fact is that women, when they come back, I've talked to a number of organizations that try to work with women veterans. They don't call themselves veterans. If they fill out a questionnaire and you have, are you a veteran, they'll say no. Then later down it says, have you been in military service? They'll say yes. Because in their mind, veteran is a male. And a lot of them won't go to the VA because to go to VA services in most VA hospitals requires you to walk through a gauntlet of men. And they don't want to do that. And there's no child care. So I've talked to, I was just let me think where I was last. I was in 5 cities in the last 10 days. Anyway, the VA there was talking about setting up a separate VA whole clinic for women only. because it's so hard to get women to come into the VA. So those are just extra layers of difficulty that women have to deal with in being in such a hyper-masculine system, even in the veteran system, not just in the active duty military system, but also coming home. The struggle to come home for women has extra hurdles built into it. And there are, the thing about the struggle to come home is, we think once they're home, everybody's happy to be home, but there also is a struggle to come home.
Tyler Boudreau, our Marine that you saw a little while ago,
yeah, good, okay.
He said, war is not hell, war is the portal to hell. Coming home is hell. And I think that that's very, very true. I'm just impressed by the power of that statement. One of the things that happens is the tremendous amount of loss that you experience when you leave that community. And being in a military unit is to be with a bunch of people who become your brothers in arms. And you have close kinds of ties with those people, closer than you have probably with anybody else. I used to write parents when I would write sympathy letters that your son probably told some of his buddies things that he would never have told you or his father or any of his family. And so what you have is a kind of multiple layer of grief when people come home. One is you lose some of your closest friends. And what happens when you lose some of your closest friends is you become isolated, and you isolate yourself. There's a loss of innocence and a loss of sense of goodness, because all of a sudden you come in and you are in a society that has not experienced the same kinds of things that you've experienced, and you feel that sense like, you know, something's happened to me. I'm no longer the innocent kind of person that I was when I left home. There's a sense of loss of discipline in a unit. I hated PT. But when I was in the Pentagon, they would say, you got to go to PT because you got to take the physical exam twice a year. So get down to the POAC and get exercise. When I came back, nobody in the Christian Reformed headquarters told me to go exercise. They kept looking to see if I was working hard enough. But then there's a loss of a weapon. And I don't think we think about that very much, but from the very beginning, when you're in combat training, you're given a weapon. At first, it's just a rubber stick, and you have to sit up. But if you fall asleep in the bleachers and that thing hits the ground, guess what? You sleep with it that night. And then you learn how to take apart the weapon and put it back together, not only in daylight, but in darkness. And you learn how to do that in the fastest possible time, like 25 seconds or so, to take that thing apart and put it back together. And pretty soon that weapon becomes an appendage for you. It becomes part of your body. And now all of a sudden you go into the civilian world and you don't have that protection. You don't have that one thing that you rely on most to keep yourself alive. Then you lose a sense of what your role is in the world. In the military, you know what your role is. You know what the expectations are. When you go into civilian life, you're not always sure. When I started working at 2850 Kalamazoo, I said, well, what's my job as director of chaplaincy ministries? They said, well, create it. Yeah, right. You know, I said, but who am I then? And what am I doing? Because if you don't know what I'm supposed to be doing and what my role is, how should somebody else? There's a loss of faith in other people, a loss of capacity for intimacy, and that leads to a lot of conflict in marriage when people come back, and a lot of problems with divorce and infidelity. There's a loss of faith in really being in a meaningful community. Because one of the things that commanders always stress in the military is the mission. And the mission is something that you subjugate yourself to all the time, so that what's really important and to be part of that unit is to be so committed to that mission that you're willing to do anything for that mission that you've been given, even to die for it. And every soldier makes an unlimited liability contract with the United States government and says, nothing will stand in the way of my finishing the mission.
We have a handout that has lists of all these things we've been talking about. So if you've been trying to take notes, don't worry. There's also a handout there from a VA clinician in San Diego about what she hears in counseling that vets won't tell their families. Things like the adrenaline rush and the kind of addiction to war that can come when people come home. They like that high. It's like the most alive they've ever felt. So as a lot of vets say, the vehicle of choice for veterans is a motorcycle. You get this rush. And so there are all kinds of things like that that also are part of what you have to give up coming home from war. That intensity, that sense that you are fully alive. When you come back to a secular kind of individualistic, narcissistic consumer culture, it's just not that satisfying. I've heard so many vets in college say, you know, I looked around and people were texting and not paying attention, and they were worried about where they were going to go, what mall they were going to go to over the weekend. And I sat there and thought to myself, I risk my life for this. So those are some of the struggle, the hurdles that come. So if this is all part of moral injury, then I think the corollary to that is how you help people recover their sense of soul, the sense of moral goodness. And most religious traditions have some understanding of what we call spirit or soul, even if, like Buddhism, they don't really much care about belief in a deity of any sort. But they have this sense of spiritual core that makes a person a human being. And one of the capacities in that is moral conscience, is to do the right thing. That this is one of the signs of having an intact soul, is that you can do moral reasoning. You may make the wrong choice sometimes, but you know when you've done it that you've made the wrong choice, and you can try to restore what you did. You can make amends because you understand that you have fallen short of what you need to do. So if you come back and you feel like you can't make a good decision, you've made so many bad decisions, you've done so many things that you're ashamed of, or so many things that you regret, that you've lost your bearings, then in some sense your soul has broken, been damaged in some way, or as Tyler says, your heart's broken. And another part of the sense of spirit or soul in most religious traditions has to do with a capacity for empathy, which some evolutionary biologists think now is actually hardwired into our biology. Partly because we're so vulnerable when we're little, we have to bond with our caregiver, and our caregiver actually has to care. That these are capacities for understanding. We have this sort of sympathetic system in our brain where we can tell what other people are feeling without them even telling us. This is what makes a good caregiver of a child a good caregiver. They can kind of tell when a child's upset. And we can do that as adults. That's a capacity for empathy. It's also the capacity for human connection, intimacy, and community. And that's something that actually, there's a way in which war limits that. You have it for your unit, but you hate your enemy. So there's a way in which, there's a wonderful essay by an Eastern Orthodox theologian in which he says, if the Spirit of God is incarnate in you, you see it in other people and you see it in other human beings. And part of the ascetics of war is that you have to shut that down, that capacity down, in a lot of directions. So part of soul repair is recovering soul, is recovering these capacities, because of course the capacity to love, the capacity to empathize, is also our capacity to connect to things in the world that are beautiful and good and true. And that's the journey home that I think is most difficult under the circumstances of moral injury. So what gets you beyond? What gets you into the recovery process? Probably the most important piece is being able to tell your story to somebody else. Now, somebody said to me that World War II vets actually had an opportunity to do this that we don't provide for vets anymore. That a lot of the World War II vets came home on troop ships, and they had a couple of weeks, they were waiting to get on the ship, and then they had a couple of weeks. They actually sat on those ships and talked to each other about what they'd experienced and done. And that's the first step, is being able to speak it. Now people they're in theater, they get sent to Kuwait or a way station where they're briefed, and there's a sort of day or two where they're told, you know, don't drink and drive, don't beat your wife, don't wear a uniform, things like that, and they get screened for PTSD, and then they get sent home. So you can be in theater, and 48 hours later, you can be washing your car in the driveway and feel like you landed from Mars. So there's not a transition, there's not any time. So the first place most veterans, if they're men, want to talk about what happened is with other veterans, because they know they won't be judged and they'll be understood. And that's a life-saving thing. As Jonathan Shea said last night, veteran groups are really important for processing moral injury because you can tell your story there. Now, if like over half the people who are serving in these wars, you're in a reservist or the National Guard, you may go home and there's not another vet in your whole town. Or if you're a woman, you may not feel comfortable talking in a group because you were so isolated in theater that you don't have that sense of camaraderie with the guys. So you may need another woman to talk to one-on-one, because you're not going to talk to your husband or your partner. That's often the hardest place to talk about what happened for a lot of veterans. But you have to tell your story. You have to, because the only way you can process the moral questions is to do that. Once you can actually get a memory narrative together and tell a story and begin to ask the moral questions, it means your frontal lobe brain is now working again. And it's engaged. It's now moving toward health. It's engaged. And part of the self-condemnation is actually an indication that that part of your brain is working. But it could be a risk to your whole being if that part of your brain says, I am so ashamed of what you did, you don't deserve to live. You're not a decent person anymore, and you don't deserve to live. So all of those things are... That telling of the story is a crucial piece, and having a place where people will listen without judgment is a crucial piece. The VA essay that first identified moral injury as a serious problem in 2009, this is a crucial piece of telling your story, is talking to a benevolent moral authority. Benevolent being the key word. You're already judging yourself. You don't need somebody else to tell you you're a terrible person. You don't need a God who's going to punish you. You're already punishing yourself. So in fact, if you believe in a harsh and punishing and judgmental God that's going to send you to hell, you dig yourself deeper into moral injury. So a benevolent moral authority that you can tell your story to, discuss your moral questions. It doesn't have to necessarily be a minister. There are plenty of people in religious traditions who understand moral struggle and can understand a question like, why did God do this to me? Or, I don't believe in God anymore because none of my prayers were answered. Those are the kind of things a clinician is not trained to handle, unless they've been to seminary, had some religion courses, or have a religious background. Those are the soul spirit questions that are really, really important. And there are other things. You have to learn to rehumanize the enemy. That's part of recovering your sense of empathy. But that's something the whole culture has to do, because it's not just the military that participates in dehumanizing the enemy. The whole culture that's supporting the war, that sent them there, also participates in the same kind of dehumanization. So when I came to the U.S. in 1956 from Japan, I was 6 years old. I went to school. I got called dirty Jap by schoolmates. Not military people, not soldiers, but just ordinary civilians that I interacted with. For a long time, I often didn't say I was Japanese unless somebody asked, because it was such a negative thing to be Japanese. In the same way that there was a whole kind of outbreak of Islamophobia in our culture after 9/11, and the war on terror was it was specifically focused on Islam, which there are plenty of other kinds of terrorists, but we suddenly decided that Islam was the enemy. So there's this dehumanization, and we have to participate in the process of rehumanization with that to come back, because we participated in the support of the war and the dehumanization as well. So those are things that have to happen for the process of recovery from moral injury. And I know plenty of vets who went back to Iraq or worked with Iraq refugee relief or with disaster relief as their way of making amends. As my friend Camila Mejia, who's a vet, says, you try to do things that restore the balance of good in the world because you've seen so much destruction. And that's also part of the process. And Herm's going to talk to you a little bit about what communities can do. There's reconnection with estranged others. Okay.
Some of the things that I think our communities can do is they can really engage in deep listening and be open to the truth about what the person is trying to tell us. I think that accurate empathy and non-judgmental warmth and positive regard are something that all of the soldiers are looking for. They don't need judgment. What they need is somebody who is willing to listen very, very deeply to the kinds of things that happen to them in combat. And combat is not a humanizing experience. It really is a dehumanizing experience. And so what people really need is someone who can listen very, very deeply to the deepest cries of their soul about what in the world did they do. When I was first in Vietnam, one of the young soldiers wanted to become a conscientious objector, but he didn't object to all wars. He just objected to the Vietnam War. And so he didn't meet the requirements of the Department of Defense. And so he put in his paperwork and they came back and said, no, you're not a conscientious objector, pick up your weapon and go out and shoot. And he made the decision that he was going to do that. He was going to go take his weapon and he would go on patrol with people, but he did not say that he was going to kill an enemy. And while they were out in the boonies, he had the opportunity to shoot and kill an enemy, and he didn't. And that enemy shot and killed 2 of his friends. And he came back really a moral basket case. He had the opportunity to do what was right, and he was cowardly because he didn't do it. And somebody has to listen to that. Then I think you have to support the kind of lifestyles that reduce some of the behavioral risks. I think it's important to, when people come back, to watch how they take care of themselves. Do they isolate themselves? Do they lock themselves in a room and only come out at night? Do they drink too much? Because the first kind of anesthetizing that we do is anesthetizing that we do by ourselves, and then later on when we go and get a doctor to do it, then that's not as bad, but it almost is. There's a great book, After Tuesday, that talks about a dog that this man got it in. The subtitle is, a golden retriever saved my life. And he talks about coming back, and he had a brilliant description of what PTSD is like and what that kind of isolation is. And then he gets this dog, Tuesday. And Tuesday saves his life. And it's just an amazing story of how animals can sense just exactly what's going on with the veterans and who are experiencing these kinds of emotional tragedies. And sometimes I wish I had the intuition of a dog or a horse. because there's a kind of compassion and something that's there that doesn't deal with any kind of judgment. The dog is just there to become affectionate and to take care of the person he's supposed to take care of. I think you have to create safe places for people to be. And creating safe places are to create the kinds of environment where people can come in, warts and all, and just be there and know that they're in a place where they're not going to be judged, they're not going to be damned, but they're just going to be accepted, and they're going to be able to be safe because people are there. When we opened the center, one of the things Rita and I discussed was saving the back row for the veterans, because they don't trust anybody at their back. So put them in the back row, and that's a safe place for them. And I'm glad that we were sensitive enough to think about that, so that when the veterans came in and they sat in the back row, they knew that somebody there knew what it meant to cover their backside, and they were thankful for that. And I think to conduct reflections on moral responsibility for the entire community, and finally to offer rituals and programs that really help the soldier with those kinds of things. When we first started this process, Rita asked me if I would look back on my time in Vietnam, and was I doing something intuitively as a chaplain, that now that I know the whole concept of moral injury, that really kind of fit. And so I started writing, and I found out that what I did was I had communion at every service after the second week I was there. And in communion, when you break the bread, what you're doing is acknowledging the fact that God participates in human suffering. And St. Paul says, after supper, he took a cup. So after the celebration of the Paschal feast, he takes a cup and says, this is a new song, a New Testament in my blood. And so you have both the fact that God participates with us in human pain, but that God also is a God who shows us hope. The other thing I did was I had the soldiers read the Psalms. The Hebrew scriptures are so filled with some magnificent pieces of work. And the book of Lamentations and the Psalms are just terrific. There are some psalms that are called the imprecatory psalms, which show about anger at God. And I used to have the soldiers read out loud some of those imprecatory psalms. And when they'd get finished, they'd close the Bible, then they'd look at the binding, then they'd open it up and look at the front page, and then they'd say, is this in my Bible too? Many of them had never read those kind of psalms before, because they're sort of the quiet, dark psalms that exist not only in the Jewish tradition, but also in the Protestant and Catholic Christian tradition. And then the Psalms of Lament. And every one of the Psalms of Lament is built the same way. First you come and you have a gripe against the deity. You have some kind of thing that really is bothering you, and you come and you say, okay, listen to me. And the Hebrew people had a way of really making that real. They would sort of grab God by the nape of the neck and pull him down. One of the Psalms says he dragged God down and poured something so that God had an ear, so he could hear. And once you present that petition to God, then suddenly you realize that you've been in this place before, and that in this place you found some kind of healing, and you accept God's forgiveness, and you understand that he is a long-suffering, a merciful, and a loving God. Amen. And then that memory sort of washes over and helps begin the whole process of healing all over again.
So as Herm said, it takes the military a minimum of about 8 weeks of completely ritualized training to take an ordinary person and turn them into a combat soldier. And believe me, it's completely ritualized. Everybody does it together. You know, you are told when you eat and where you eat. You march together, you're one unit. This is what ritual is. This is repeat, repeat, repeat until you get it, right? If anybody's tried to learn a sport, you know this is the same thing with learning a sport. When I took a ski lesson for a week one time for 8 hours a day, all day we followed the instructor down the mountain. He made us do our body in a certain way, and we tried and tried and tried. And after, it was a miracle. After a week of this, 8 hours, I jumped 2 levels as a skier. Not because I thought it through, but because it was all ritualized in my body. By the end of that week, I did not have to think about what my body was doing. It just knew how to do it. So ritual is actually how we actually learn and embed things deep in our bodies and our beings. Thinking about it is shallow. It has to be deep in your brain and body for it to stick. And that's the function of ritual. The military knows this better than anybody. It has some of the best rituals you can imagine. Not just basic training, but rituals of lamentation and memorial, and all that. The military does this very, very well. Better, I think, most of the time than churches. So what's an effective ritual? An interesting one is in this man's book. His name is Chester Nez. He wrote a book called Code Talker. Everybody know who the code talkers in World War II were? They were the Navajo that invented the code in the Pacific War that is the only code the Japanese never broke, and until they invented that code, the Allies were losing the war in the Pacific. So lots of people believe the Navajo code talkers were the key to the winning of the Pacific War. And Chester Nez was one of the original 30 that invented the code. The irony, of course, is that the policy of the U.S. had been to try to de-Indianize all the Native Americans by punishing people for speaking their language in the boarding schools. So he describes in his book how they were punished for speaking Navajo, but he was from a very traditional Navajo family, sheep herders in the checkerboard area of New Mexico, and so he spoke it fluently, and the guys he worked with did, and they invented a code, and eventually there were 400 of them. But he was in the original 30, so he was in Pacific Theater a very, very long time fighting because there were so few of them, they didn't get any breaks. So when he came home, he spent 3 months in the San Francisco VA hospital, probably for exhaustion and other stresses and things like that, and then he went home. He took up his life as a sheep herder again, and he tried to do it for 6 months, and he finally told his parents that he was going to kill himself. He said, I can't stand it. The Japanese ghosts haunt me day and night. I can't sleep. They're with me all the time. They haunt me. Why did you kill me? I can't function. And I think I just need to die. So his family, this is a long tradition in Navajo culture, they have a ceremonial called the enemy way. So his family sent him to a diagnostician. The diagnostician said, okay, you need a 9-day enemy way. That's a serious one. They can last up to 2 weeks, but sometimes they're for a day or two. But he needed a 9-day one. So they hired the singer. These singers specialize in certain chants, and the enemy way is a specialization. And the man put together the ceremonial. And how it works is an invitation goes out to the entire Navajo community, and anyone who wants to come and commit for that whole 9 days can come and participate. The family agrees to feed everybody for the 9 days, whoever comes. And so then the leader of he's called a singer because it's a oral chanting that goes on for 9 days, and nothing's written down, he just knows how to do it. And so for 9 days, he laid down a sand painting, he did the choreography, the chanter led the whole thing. And Nez says it's secret, so I'm not going to tell you the details. He says, but it's kind of like one person memorizing the entire Wagnerian operatic ring cycle, knowing the choreography, the costumes, the words, the score, and directing the whole thing for 9 days. And when it was done, the ghosts went away. He was fine for 26 years. He had children, kind of had a life. But because he was in the Code Talker group, he was not allowed to tell his story. He couldn't speak of what he'd done. He couldn't even say where he'd been in the Pacific. He just was able to say, oh, I was in a few fights. That's really all he could say. So they declassified the code after 26 years, and he testified before Congress. He started telling his story, finally, at last. And the ghost came back. Right? Because now all those memories that he's been trying to repress come up. So his family had another enemy way, and for good measure, they added a blessing way to make sure he was all right. So that 9-day ritual is more like, it's not the same thing as, but it's more like the ancient Christian penance tradition. And there was just a standard penance system that the ancient church had for returning warriors that they just actually required warriors to go through. They expected people to have their souls damaged by war, and they expected to have to help them get better. So they had these profound ritual processes, sometimes being in the order of penitence lasted for months or even years. So the most famous case of this is in Augustine's Confessions, in which the Bishop Ambrose of Milan excommunicated the sitting emperor for ordering a massacre. The emperor himself just ordered it. He didn't actually kill anybody, but he ordered it. So he underwent 9 months of coming to church to the daily Eucharist, which he couldn't participate in because he was excommunicated from the Eucharist, coming in plain sackcloth and praying prostrate and weeping. And Augustine describes the entire congregation weeping for their fallen emperor for 9 months. Now, when the penance system was over and he was recommunicated, he moved the capital to Milan to get a different bishop. He moved out to Constantinople to get a different bishop. But he had to undergo penance. So this is deep ritual. The ancient Christian church and a lot of traditional cultures understand that you can't, we're post-Enlightenment. The Protestant church is pretty much a post-Enlightenment church. We think thinking makes you who you are, which is the most shallow level at which the executive brain that thinks is important. It's not that it's not crucial for monitoring behavior and making us moral, but really where we're changed in a deep way is deep in our limbic brain system. The military knows this. So if we're going to have effective rituals, we have to repeat them a lot. They have to be beautiful, because beauty touches the soul. We have almost no sense of aesthetics, at least in my Protestant church, except for the music sometimes. I think we have to really, if we're going to provide effective ritual that's actually healing of people, that's actually supportive of a process of recovery, I think we have to think about what the poetry, not the prose, but the poetry is like, what the rich visual space that's beautiful is like. All the things that in the Navajo enemy way context, they don't even think about. They just know it has to be there. The sand painting, the dancing, the singing, all of that. So it takes that kind of intense ritual to make a person be changed. And most of us probably don't think too much. If you grew up in a religious tradition, you just kind of went through it over years and years and years of repetition. It's sort of it. But if you don't have that, it doesn't have a lot of meaning. If you tell somebody, it's like I came from Japan. I was in a Buddhist family when I was 6, and I came from Japan, and I got dumped into military Protestant churches. And they would, talk about Jesus and the Bible and stuff. And so being a good student, I read the Bible, and the Jesus I heard about in Sunday school did not match the Jesus I was reading about. The Jesus I read about in the Bible sounded like a rude white guy to me. He yelled at people, he called them, it was like he argued with, it's not Japanese to do that. So I just didn't understand Christianity for years because I didn't have a ritual system and I didn't grow up in it. And Jesus really didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Even though I read the Bible and I heard these stories, I didn't have that emotional center in my brain that was trained to feel who he was. It just wasn't part of it. So it took me all the way to college to figure Jesus out, and then I liked him. But this issue is really important, and I'm just going to end, and because I know we're running late, I'm going to end with just some issues around thinking theologically, or thinking as a Christian or as a person of faith about what might be helpful in trying to understand this concept of moral injury. And one of them is that a person who's in a state of moral injury is living in this intermediary liminal space of holding death while trying to stay alive. So there's a whole lot of death being carried in the person. And they're trying to process what that means in relation to carrying that for the rest of their lives. Because it's not that you ever, recovery is not that you ever forget what happened. But you have to figure out how to carry it and how to make it part of yourself and part of your life. But you have to find a way to step forward and move in a way that it becomes part of your life and not the thing that dominates your life. And that's partly time, it's partly ritual, it's partly friends who can accompany you on this process of learning to carry it as not a debilitating load. So my friend Camilo Mejia says, he had a therapist who tried to make him feel better about killing someone in Iraq, and he said, you know, you obeyed orders, and the guy had a grenade, and maybe he was too far away that time, but he might have killed somebody later, and you were ordered to shoot. You did the right thing. You shouldn't be so hard on yourself. And Camilo's response was, well, yeah, intellectually I agree with you, but I don't feel any better. He said, and I don't. And he thought about that. He thought, why did he feel so bad? And he thought a long time about it, and he decided he didn't need to feel better. That if he started feeling okay about killing someone, he would no longer be a moral person. So what he's come to is, I've accepted that as something true about me, that I did that, and I feel terrible about it. I've learned to accept it and move on and try to be a better person, to do good in the world, to restore the balance of good in the world with my life, because I never want to feel good about killing somebody. So that's one approach, but that means he's still holding himself in this space of carrying death, moving forward in life. And that's, in the Christian tradition, we tend to move very quickly to resurrection, as if the resurrection erased everything that happened before. And it doesn't. Even in the resurrection appearances, if you read them carefully, the sorrow is still there. And I think it's really important to honor that. Not to say a war is ever over in the sense that we don't have to deal with the aftermath. As a culture, as a people, as well as individuals. Because these masks that you've been seeing were done by a group of Canadian veterans in a PTSD group. They were creating masks for how they were feeling. And this captures that, like, this is the war, this is what I'm carrying, but I'm trying to get here. And holding both. So I'm just going to read a little passage to conclude from the end of Soul Repair. And then I don't know how much time. Herman and I will be here all day if you have questions. We seek a society that can understand that war and its aftermaths belong to all of us and are our responsibility. We believe that understanding moral injury can move our society into a different future. We seek a future that sustains our society's soul, the empathy and moral conscience that sustain our humanity. We seek a society that faces danger by holding sacred the difficult assembling of meaning, the respect for truth, the alliance of heart and mind, and the construction of life-sustaining relationships so injured by war. Thank you.
I on here? Yeah, good. I want to thank our speakers. A brilliant presentation, really heartfelt and clear, taking very difficult concepts and really putting them right out there. We're going to have a 15-minute break. Rita will be signing books in the, I guess in the lobby, I guess you'd say. Please go buy one. They're great. They're wonderful books. And we'll see you back here at 10:45 for the panel discussion.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tori Van Draat, and I work for the Howenstein Center for Presidential Studies, and I am stepping in for Director Gleaves Whitney, who couldn't make it in this morning with a family thing. So I am happy to welcome you to the Hidden Wounds of War conference. It's a conference in partnership with the Howenstein Center, the Michigan Combat PTSD Task Force, and the Soul Repair Center of Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. This conference has been a work in progress over the last 6 years. It first started in 2008 when the Howenstein Center brought Dr. Michael Ryan and Carolyn Carino in for a conference on PTSD back then. And from that conference, they learned about a lot of people in the community who had a passion for working with veterans. And so over the past 6 years, we've been working together to put on this conference. So thank you so much for being here. It's great to see everyone coming out bright and early on a Saturday morning. And I am going to introduce the introducer, Miss Carolyn Carino. She received her bachelor's in psychology and sociology from GVSU and earned a master's in clinical social work and specialist in alcohol and drug abuse from Western Michigan University. She has served as an adjunct professor for GVSU's social work graduate program, and she is co-founder of the Michigan Combat PTSD Task Force with Dr. Michael Ryan. Ms. Carino owns Grand Rapids Center for Psychotherapy and has been practicing for 29 years. Carolyn Carino.
Good morning. I want to take an opportunity to thank some people before I introduce. It won't be long. First of all and foremost, I want to thank the Howenstein Center and the woman that just introduced me, Tori Van Draat. Michael and I have said many times she has served as our frontal lobes. She's very good at organizing. This is her first conference, and it's coming off very smoothly. So thank you so much, Tori. I also like to thank my fellow task force members, Michigan Combat PTSD Task Force, Michael Ryan, Dr. Michael Ryan, who practices here in Grand Rapids, and he's a co-founder. Charles Runyon, who is from Runyon Enterprises. He's done all our website work and our IT work. Kathy Rent, who's also a Howenstein employee. And, of course, Herman Keizer. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock. She's a research professor in theology and culture and founding co-director of the Soul Repair Center and a commissioned minister of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. She's been a founding director of Faith Voices for the Common Good since 2004 and was a senior consulting editor in religion at the New Press from 2006 through 2008. From 2001 to 2002, she was a fellow at the Harvard Divinity School Center for Values in Public Life, and from 1997 to 2001, she directed the fellowship program at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. This is an advanced research program, Advanced Research Institute for Outstanding Scholars, Artists, Humanitarian Leaders, and Scientists. That's at Harvard. Okay. She was on the strategic planning team that organized the Radcliffe-Harvard merger in 1999. Before her time at Harvard, Dr. Brock taught religion and women's studies for 18 years at a number of colleges and universities, including holding the endowed chair in the humanities at Hamline University from 90 to 97. She's a native, and I'm sorry, Dr. Brock, if I mispronounce this, I hope I do it right, Fukuoka, thank you, Japan. Dr. Brock is the daughter of a veteran, I can relate to her there, of the Korean War, and also the stepdaughter of a U.S. Army veteran of World War II and the Vietnam War. And so she was raised in a military family. She's the first Asian American woman ever to earn a doctorate in theology at Claremont Graduate University, and she got that in 1988, and the first ever to serve on the board of directors of the American Academy of Religion. In December 2008, she and Dr. Gabriella Latini began work on the Truth Commission on Conscience in War, which in November 2010 recommended extensive public education on moral injury. She's an award-winning author, and she and Dr. Latini co-authored Soul Repair. I recommend that you get that book. It's called Soul Repair, Recovery from Moral Injury After War. Next, my introduction of Chaplain Keizer is going to be less formal because, just because. And I have the honor to introduce to you one of our keynote speakers here too. He's a member of the Michigan Combat PTSD Task Force. I first met Herm about 5 years ago, I think. I noticed at our first meeting he had a talent of squeezing himself in. And he also squeezed his point in. But also, he put to words, which I experienced with many World War II Pacific Theater Marines, that they were struggling with, and it was called moral injury. This caught my attention and intrigued me. And coming from a Marine Corps family, the word chaplain is like, you got to be a little cautious. But he seemed to zero right in on that and sense my distance. And then he told me one time about falling from a Huey, which is a helicopter for those that don't know that. And I said, oh my gosh, what was that like? Were you praying? He goes, no, all he said was, oh shit. I thought, I like this chaplain. And Herm Keizer's also very humble, though. It took a while, but he told me more about himself. And I found out that he was ordered some medals that are usually for people only in the bush, and chaplains are rarely in the bush. I don't know any chaplains that are awarded the Superior Defense Medal with an oak leaf cluster, or the Legion of Merit with 3 oak leaf clusters, the Soldier's Medal, and the Bronze Star with a V for Valor. Of course, we expect, and he did get the Good Conduct Medal, we expect that. I'm going to have to walk real fast later. Herm is fiercely loyal, though, to his brothers and sisters in arms. He works tirelessly to surround himself with people who can help. We're talking about how to do this conference. You go, oh yeah, sure, I can call up General Shinseki, who's the U.S. Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Oh yeah, I'll call Dr. Shea and have him come in. Oh sure, I'll have General Xenakis come in and speak. And he did it. And I'm thinking, oh geez, I thought I was a big deal because I got to have a tour of the Pentagon. And Herm is also very, very sensitive in a good way. I have been having some personal struggles I've been struggling with over the past 3 years, and I've taken comfort in his kind words and his prayers. Herm, I know Herm has seen some unspeakable things. On 9/11, when the Pentagon was fiercely in flames, he rushed toward it. And he's experienced the dreadfulness of war. He served in Vietnam. He demanded to be in the bush with the grunts. That's not common for a chaplain. He's reminded daily of war. He's carrying the pain of his combat wounds, physical and other wounds. He will not allow us to forget. He'll not allow us to forget those that have served our country, those who have walked into fire, and who courageously pulled others from carnage. He will not allow us to forget those who have bravely faced their internal horrors to heal physically, emotionally, and spiritually. He will not let us forget our warriors. He voraciously seeks out those who will join him in his lifelong commitment to those he has lost in combat and those who survive. He keeps hope and faith alive in me and others, and that there'll be a day when no man or woman will suffer from combat PTSD or moral injury. He keeps hope and faith alive in me and others, that no one who has the courage to serve our country, no man, no woman, will ever be left behind again. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud and honored to present Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock and Colonel Chaplain Herman Keizer.